In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a podcast project that I introduced into an online introductory microeconomics class during the fall semesters of 2019 and 2020. So first, perhaps, we should talk a little bit about why a podcast project might be interesting. One reason for doing this is it's a form of an open pedagogy project, which gives students some degree of autonomy. And we know from a fair amount of research that students appreciate having some say over how their course is structured. They like to have some say over the assignments they do. It's very consistent with a universal design for learning approach. Another reason for introducing this is it gives students an opportunity to take the theoretical concepts they're learning in the course and to make their own connections to what they observe in the world around them. And we know that when students are able to connect what they're learning to other things in their life, they tend to learn things much more deeply. So the connections they make during these projects makes the content more memorable, and they tend to learn it more deeply. As David Wiley and others have noted, most of the assignments that students receive in their classes tend to be disposable assignments, where they complete some work. They often spend a lot of time writing a paper or creating some project. It gets uploaded to the learning management system. They get some feedback on it, and then they never see it again. In fact, they often lose access to it if they haven't saved their own copy for use later. A podcast, though, is something that once they create it, can live beyond the life of the class. In my class, students are given the option of posting them publicly on a public site, and so they have a takeaway from the class which demonstrates some of what they've learned. And students have noted that they really appreciate this because it allows them to share what they've done with their parents who may be helping them pay their bills. It also gives them something they can link to on their LinkedIn profile or if they're creating a portfolio. So it's something that students find value in having this assignment that exists and demonstrates what they've learned beyond just the traditional paper assignment. And the podcast is also a form of authentic assessment because they can see the value that this has for people outside of the class, that they're creating some content that has value for other people as well as perhaps just for themselves. And in general, creating a podcast can be fun. And while students may not always see this initially, as they move into the process, they generally find the process to be quite a bit of fun once they create the final version. So the basic assignment that I gave to students in the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020 is to complete 2 podcasts related to topics in their introductory microeconomics course. They worked in groups of either 2 or 3 students this year. Last year, they did it either individually or in pairs. The first podcast has to relate to content in the first half of the semester, and the other podcast project relates to content they're learning in the second half of the semester. And they all involve applications of the core concepts that they're learning in the course itself, and they're taking those concepts and seeing how they can use it to explain things they observe in the news or in their personal relationships or in the world around them. Last year, since this was the first time I did this, I wanted to get a sense of what concerns students might have before this, so I gave them a simple survey asking what they were concerned about with this project. And there were 2 basic themes that came back in most of the surveys. One was they weren't sure they possessed either the hardware or the knowledge of how to create a podcast. And the second was they really don't like to hear the sound of their own voice, and that's a common experience for faculty as well. When you hear your voice recorded, it doesn't sound like your own internal perception of the voice, and that can be a little disconcerting. So before we went any further, I did a couple of things to try to address these concerns. The first is I provided students with detailed instructions on what software they could use and what types of hardware they'd need to record their podcast. Most students just simply used their mobile devices, their mobile phones. Some used laptops. All the students had access to some type of mobile device or a laptop that they could use for recording. Since they were doing it in groups this term, most of them recorded simply using Zoom. Given that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, they weren't able to meet in person, and it was an asynchronous course where students did not generally meet in person anyway. So this provided a nice opportunity for students to work in small groups in Zoom and learn how to use the video conferencing software and to record their own interactions. And to show students that it wouldn't really be very difficult to do this, I had them do a really low-stakes initial assignment to help them get past their fears. I had them listen to, since this is an economics class, a short Planet Money Indicator, Trade Talks, or Pandemic Economics podcast, and to just record an audio response to it. And I asked them to describe the main argument in the podcast and just to describe their reaction to it in 2 to 5 minutes, and then to submit that into a Dropbox in our learning management system. And they were all able to do that, and that tended to just get them past those initial concerns. The first step was to form groups. Last year, I did not require this, and only a few students chose to form groups. This year, my fall class was a bit larger, with nearly 60 students in the class, so I decided this time I was going to mandate groups, partly to make the work a little bit easier for me, as well as perhaps to make the work a little bit more enjoyable for them and to give them a little bit more sense of interaction and communication and community within the class. So I provided them with a list of the key concepts for that half of the semester, one in the first half, another one in the second half of the semester, and I set up a discussion forum where they could find partners and decide on their topic. So students would post things they were interested in working in. Other people would perhaps suggest modifications or other things that were related they might work on. And then within a week, they all had to form their groups. And then they filled out a Google form where they provided a list of the partners on their team, the title of the podcast they were planning, and a brief description. And then within a few days, I gave them some feedback on that, mostly just telling them if it looked feasible. And perhaps if it looked like they may be heading in a direction that wouldn't be very productive, I gave them some suggestions on things they may want to consider. And then the following week, they met using Zoom. All of our students now, since we are now in the midst of a pandemic, my institution now has Zoom accounts for any student that would like one. So the students met over Zoom in their groups at times that worked best for them. They were given a choice of either submitting a detailed outline listing their arguments or a script. And what I encourage them to do is, as a group or individually, to just put together a very brief presentation where the first time they just speak in a free-form manner, the second time they work from an outline, and the third time they read from a script. And I suggested that they record those and see which one sounded the best. And what most of them found was that having a detailed outline worked very well. For others, a script worked well, but in some cases it came out sounding a little bit stilted. So I left it up to them what they were going to use. But basically at this stage, I wanted them to formulate their arguments and submit them so I could give them some feedback, because since they were just learning some of these concepts, I wanted to make sure that they were using the concepts correctly. And if not, I'd raise some questions and give them some feedback suggesting things they may want to consider or things perhaps that they may want to discuss in their podcast that they hadn't yet addressed. The next step was to have them record their final podcast and to submit it. Before they submitted this, I asked them to look at the rubric that I had shared on the podcast audio, and when they were recording it, to take those things into account. It mentioned things like the organization, the structure, whether the voices were relatively clear, but most of the weight was actually placed on whether they applied economic concepts in a substantive and generally accurate manner. So they submitted their audio. I gave them feedback using the rubric and often some other suggestions. And then they were able to do this over and over again if they needed to. Many of them were fine on the first attempt. Others resulted in a second attempt. None of the students required more than 2 attempts, and most of the changes were fairly minor, and I think that only applied to maybe about 20% or less of the class. Once they were happy with the podcast audio, and I gave them 2 weeks for this stage of the project, the next step was to submit their final podcast. And in doing that, they again were given a Google form where they submitted the title of the podcast, an abstract of the podcast, and I did have to explain to them what an abstract was, since many of the students are freshmen, they haven't run into that concept before, and then a transcript. And I gave them instructions on how to use Otto.ai. I suggested they could use other things. They could create their own, or they could submit their script if they had stuck to that. But I did note that it was helpful for them to learn how to create accessible multimedia. So using this tool and then cleaning it up a bit was a good experience, I think, for them. And then also, obviously, the final podcast audio. And then the The last thing I asked them was whether they wanted to have this podcast posted publicly or if they wanted it to be kept solely within the class. Because at the start of the project, I had told them the final version of everything they create would be shared with their classmates, but they would have the option of posting a public podcast. But I left that up to them because some students have legitimate reasons why they don't want their podcast posted publicly. In the first year I did this, one of the podcasts involved a very good economic critique of some of the policies that their employer was engaged in. And they quite reasonably did not want to post that publicly. And I certainly understood why they did that, but I did feel bad that such really good analysis was not going to see the light of day. And then once that happened, the podcasts were shared within the class. Since the final submission was done with a Google form, all the responses from that form, all that information was already there, including the link to the file that the students had uploaded. I cleaned it up a little bit because in some cases there were multiple submissions. In some cases they had left out something and then they submitted it later. But I cleaned that up and shared it as a PDF with the participants in the class. And I shared the folder that contained the podcast audio with the class and only the class as well. So access to the files were restricted only to the students in the class. And that way they could listen to each other's podcasts. And for those students who are willing to share their podcast publicly, they're posted on a podcast hosting site, the address of which is listed here. And I'm also working on a website that will have a cleaner format for all the podcasts. And I'm hoping that'll be ready sometime later this fall. So as of now, only the podcasts that students were willing to make public from fall 2019 have been posted. Podcasts from the fall 2020 podcasts are, at the time of this recording, just coming in. But because we're in the midst of a pandemic and I'm also running a teaching center, I suspect I may not be able to get those up in time for the conference presentation. However, they will all be posted later this semester and they will be publicly available for all those students who chose to make their podcast public. So I will also include a link to this in the comments on this voice thread. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, you can either leave a comment on this voice thread or send me an email at john.kane@oswego.edu. Thanks for listening, and if you have any suggestions, I'd certainly appreciate them. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference.